Conway Hall, London, where ethics matter.
Hello, everybody. I'm very interested to look at this one, actually, because I'm going to read the book. What we're going to look at this morning is how did our ancestors use the concept of demons to explain sleep paralysis? Is that carving in the porch of your local church really what you think it is? And what's that tapping noise on the roof of your car? That all sounds very sinister. I think it probably will end up being rather sinister. We're talking about dark folklore. This is Mark Norman this morning. He has written a book with playwright Tracy Norman. And, of course, do catch the dark side of which is the podcast? The Folklore Podcast, because that covers all of these things as well. There's a book at the back of the room, and Mark will be selling those, including his other books. The Black Dog book that Mark wrote, I recommend very highly. I really enjoyed it. So, welcome onto the stage, Mark Norman.
Thanks, Deborah, very much. Thanks to Scott for inviting me back again. It obviously wasn't that bad last time I was here. Last time I was here, I also opened the proceedings. So for those that were there and are not sure, the standard procedure when you open an event like this, because people arrive late, is to turn around and look at them accusingly when they come in. Have a seat. It's nice to see you all in front of me. Hello, people on the live stream. I hope it's working. I hope this is working. If I press this, I should get a slide. That's mine. Great. Excellent. That looks like the sort of talk I'm going to give, so that's okay. Right. Yes, indeed. We are going to talk about dark folklore. We're not going to talk about the book specifically. We are going to talk about various contents from the book and look at some of the angles of this subject, which Deborah has already alluded to. For those that don't know me, yes, I am the creator and host of the Folklore Podcast. I'm also the curator of the Folklore Library and Archive, which is a new organisation set up to collect, preserve and make available folklore for researchers in the future. Jeremy Hart, who is speaking on the programme later on this morning, is our curatorial consultant. Thank you, Jeremy. I might ask you a question one day. And our patron is Michael Rosen. These are my other two books that I have at the back of the room. Black Dog Folklore is a study of spectral apparitions of ghostly black dogs in the landscape. Telling the Bees, which very conveniently launched in March of 2020. A lockdown is a great time to launch a new book. Hasn't yet really had a physical kind of launch, so we could call this a launch for that too. And that looks at folklore and rural craft. But today, we are looking at dark folklore. Now, we all like a creepy story in some form or another. For some of us, we might enjoy the actual scares that come with a good horror movie or a paranormal story. Others might be a little more squeamish, but still enjoy something which sends a shiver down the spine. If we look into our more superstitious past, then you'll see that it's laden with such stories. Monsters, ghosts, and demons abound. Now, before the benefits of science and good medical knowledge to help us understand the world around us, these things were our scapegoats. They were responsible for many of the things which happened to us as human beings. And so, methods were devised or suggested for stopping them doing those things. And that's the angle that we take in the first chapter of this book, which explores sleep paralysis, the nightmare. 2 words, nightmare, or old hag phenomenon, if you like. I've touched on the subject on the podcast for those that listen regularly, but this goes into more detail. Now, I don't know how many of you have suffered from a sleep paralysis episode at some point in your life, but if you have, then it's not unusual. Statistics on this subject say that roughly 8% of the population have experienced sleep paralysis at least once in their life in some form. Now, sleep paralysis takes place when we're entering or coming out of REM, rapid eye movement sleep. Not listening to REM, that's a different thing. Physically, it presents exactly how you would imagine the sufferer being unable to move the head or the torso or the limbs. Often it's accompanied with some form of hallucination, which will inevitably cause fright in the sufferer. Also the feeling of pressure on the chest or an inability to breathe, a hallmark of an episode, which led to a lot of this old folklore surrounding nighttime visitations by demons, such as is represented in this very well-known piece of art on the subject. Now, we might think that these beliefs originated from the medieval period, where there's a lot of these sorts of stories emerging, but in fact, discussion of sleep paralysis occurs in both European and Chinese writings from the last 2,000 years. Now, a number of sources suggest that the earliest reference to what we might now call sleep paralysis is found in 400 BC. I would counter that accusation because I think it's a little more speculative than some people give credit for. Now, the book that's being referred to in this particular source is a book called Zhuli Chunguan. It's from the pre-Qin period, where the Chinese government had members of imperial staff whose job it was to officially interpret dreams. And they placed these dreams into 6 categories. One of these categories was called Yimeng, which means dreams of surprise, and another one, Zhumeng, which means fearful dreams. And that was more the category for nightmares. Now, these are the areas where there's been some suggestion that accounts of sleep paralysis might be found, but they're really rather tenuous than I'd like to see to say that this is categorically what they are. If you want to look to the Chinese for an origin, you'd be better looking in the Eastern Han dynasty between 30 and 124 AD. This was when the first Chinese dictionary was written, and that dictionary included the written character Yan. Now, this character was made up of 2 individual Chinese characters, one for ghost and one for the word oppression. So the broad meaning of Yan is something akin to being oppressed by a ghost at night and paralyzed. That seems more familiar to me. Now, in early Greek accounts, the feeling of pressure on the chest or difficulty in breathing during sleep is referred to as throttling, something which suggests strangulation. Because of this, some ascribe the first recorded case of sleep paralysis to a Greek physician, Themison of Laodicea. Again, it's not very clear-cut. He refers to the concept of throttling in some letters of the time, but there's no description of a complete case, so we can't say for certain that it is what we would term sleep paralysis. For that, I think you need to look to the Byzantine period and the physician Paulus Aegineta. He wrote in the 7th century, and at that time, he examined what he termed the Incubus and Succubus. So that concept moves us on in time to medieval Europe. Pretty much anything at this time which wasn't perceived as good was the result of demonic intervention. And we have the church at the time to thank for that approach. So it naturally became ascribed to the medical condition of sleep paralysis. We know that society at this time was much more patriarchal than it is now, but sometimes medieval folklore does deliver on gender equality. And that's the case here, because we have female demons preying on men as well as male demons preying on women, the incubus and the succubus. The Latin for nightmare is incubo, and this is the root from which we see the development of the incubus in medieval superstition. Now, the incubus is the male demon who lay with sleeping women and had intercourse with them. These women were able to father children, and that fact was undoubtedly used to explain away illegitimate or unwanted pregnancies. The child from one of these encounters was known as a cambion. So the Arthurian Merlin, for example, was said to have been the result of an incubus sleeping with his mother. That's the way in which he gained his magical skills in some of the versions of that story. written records suggest that women were attacked by incubi far more than men were attacked by succubi. And because of that, folklore now tells us that there was only one succubus to every 9 incubi. Now that might be down to the method of impregnation. That requires the incubus to be something not unlike a worker bee. So, according to the Malleus Maleficarum, the succubus would collect semen from the male victim and would then pass it on to the incubus, who would take it around and use it to impregnate human women. That, says the Malleus Maleficarum, is how traditionally impotent demons are able to sire children. Now, I mentioned earlier that sleep paralysis can also include hallucination, and these hallucinations are usually drawn from popular culture. So if we fast forward again to modern reports, that's something that's been examined by the psychologist Dr. Susan Blackmore, be well known to many of you, I'm sure. And Susan has looked at not this form, but this form, alien abduction, as part of the sleep paralysis myth. So here's an extract from Susan's work. She says, most experiences begin in bed at night. The abductee experiences an intense blue or white light, a buzzing or humming sound, anxiety, and the sense of an unexplained presence. He or she is then transported or floated into a craft and may be restrained or paralyzed and subjected to examinations, medical procedures, or the implantation of a small object in the nose or elsewhere. The aliens are typically grey, about 4 feet high, with a large head and black almond-shaped eyes, although other aliens are occasionally reported. End quote. If you want to know how these aliens feature in it, they do, and you'll have to buy the book to find out. As a bonus, you'll also see the relevance of Scooby-Doo to this subject as well. Now, we've seen there how the church is responsible for ascribing demonic aspects to sleep paralysis, but the interplay between church and folklore can often be quite complex and not at all what you would expect. So in chapter 2 of the book, The Dark Church, that's something which Tracy explores, and she points out that we could think of churches in a number of different ways, depending on who we are and what our beliefs might be. So some of us would see the church as a sacred space, others as something more liminal and otherworldly. All of these people, however, leave their mark on the church in some way. That might be physically, through architecture or through apotropaic graffiti, or it might be through spells or rituals, for example. Now, the non-Christian imagery that we find in churches is a subject of great fascination, and it's that secular aspect of church graffiti which partly explains the many non-Christian images which we can find, from mermaids to heraldry to foliate heads and lots more. Those who created carvings used imagery which held significance for them at the time, and this is as likely to draw from superstitious influences as it is from regular church beliefs. The fact that no records have been left behind from the creation of much of this imagery means that all we can do now is to speculate as to what the significance for these people might have been. Now, the Sheila na gig is probably one of the more unexpected things that you would find in a medieval church, although, of course, they aren't limited to just those buildings. We do find them in non-religious places as well. Most of you probably know what they are. There's a couple of examples here which I photographed at the British Museum. Now, these aren't ones which are on public display. I took this photograph in the storage bit of the British Museum in the basement underneath. The Sheila na gigs are female grotesques, generally sitting naked with their legs splayed and holding the vulva open with both hands. Most people will know the image. As with a lot of folklore, their origins aren't clear, and that includes the name as well. So they appear to date from somewhere between the 12th and the 16th centuries, although some scholars would put them older than this. They may, or they may not, have been influenced by grotesques found in Europe. So that covers every base. There is a belief in Ireland that some women were also called Sheila na gigs and that they would expose themselves in order to ward off the evil eye. Now, there are certainly stories from across the world of women driving off evil by exposing their genitals. In Ireland, again, you have the story of Queen Med, who, being outnumbered on the battlefield, exposes herself to her enemies in this way, leading to them retreating in a state of confusion. There are also more obvious links to fertility, such as the mythological story of the Greek goddess Demeter, for example. Now, the interpretation of the Sheila can take on many forms, from this fertility goddess, through apotropaic readings, through to some kind of warning against the perceived evil of female sexuality. There has even been a relatively recent suggestion that the Sheila is a form of toad goddess. Much more variety than the traditional reading that she is part of the church's campaign against immorality. That interpretation needed to adopt the skirt-raising aspect of Queen Med's story and then reappropriate it. Now, a clue to the possible apotropaic use of the Sheila na gig might be found in the location that they crop up. A number are positioned over doorways or at some other threshold. That naturally suggests a protective element. Now, I'd like to show you an unusual carving from a church porch to see whether you think it might have had some kind of link to the Sheila. Sorry, Jeremy, you've seen this before. Now, this porch in question is that of St Mary the Virgin Church in Chipping Norton in Oxfordshire, a place that we visited at a previous Folklore Society event. It has a vaulted ceiling which a number of carved stone bosses are set into, including a lion and a green man, and what the church guide describes as a sheep overpowering a wolf, seen on the left of this slide. The carving is oval-shaped, with the sheep's head sitting directly above the wolf's. I like to think of it as a wolf wearing one of those sort of large comical hats with ear flaps that cruel parents like me used to put small children in before they grew up and told you off for it. So the limbs of the sheep reach round on either side, creating this oval shape, and the sheep forces the wolf's jaws apart with anthropomorphic hands. But do you think this carving has always been a sheep overpowering a wolf? Because to us, it looks a lot like a potential reworking of an old Sheila to make it more acceptable to public consumption. So if that's the case, what's the evidence for that? Well, the carving seems a lot less worn at the top of the boss when you look at it closely than it does at the bottom. It also has some differences in style compared to the other carvings in the porch. The fleece is worked in a similar way to the hair on the human head and the mane of the lion that you can see on the right-hand side of this slide. But there's far less detail. The eyes are more simplistic than the other carvings when you look at them in close. The limbs of the sheep seem to resemble arms, but what look like little cuffs at the wrist and very thick shoulders. The wolf, by contrast, is pretty plain. It's got large eyes, no obvious ears, hardly any features at all. Almost like there was something else which has been chiselled away and flattened down. The strange shape of the nose of the wolf coincides with the position that the top of the vulva would have been in if this had been a Sheila. Now, we do know that the Victorians removed a large number of Sheilas. Did this one get disguised as something else? Maybe the church interpretation of this carving of the wolf and the sheep isn't quite right, and it's not supposed to be a sheep overpowering a wolf, but maybe it's drawing on Matthew 7:15, if you know your Bible, a representation of false prophets, literally the wolf in sheep's clothing. Who knows? The church has always had an interesting relationship with magic and superstition. Sometimes we see this in what the church terms miracles. Other times it's a crossover with older traditions, like the blessing of the plough to return a good harvest. There are many stories from my area of the UK, down in the southwest, of what we like to call conjuring parsons. One of these, Parson Joe, used to record astrological calculations in a notebook which he made for his parishioners. Others, such as the Reverend Frank Parker, were said to have libraries of magical books and were known for their occult abilities. that's actually quite a common folklore trope. But another story told of Frank Parker is that a visitor once discovered him in bed surrounded by dead toads. Now, toad magic is very common in my area of the country. One example also utilises the power of the churchyard in a charm to destroy what used to be termed black witchcraft at one time. Here's an example of a ritual which worked in this way. 3 stone jars need to be gathered along with 3 frog livers and 3 toad hearts. The livers should be stuck full of new pins and the hearts stuck with the thorns from a holy thorn bush. One of each of the hearts and the livers should be placed into each of the stone jars. The person working the ritual should visit 3 different graveyards and bury one of the jars in the path of each, at a certain depth and at a certain distance from the church porch. Anyone undertaking this ritual, it was said, would become immune to the evil influence of witches afterwards. Reverend Parker was also said to have appeared after death in a fascinating case haunting his rectory. This is Devon's equivalent of Borley Rectory, if you like. Luffingcott Rectory, which sat in the parish of that name, was around half a mile to the east of the church. The Reverend Frank Parker was rector here for around 45 years from the year 1835. He farmed the glebe there as well at the time and in fact used to hold traditional harvest home celebrations for his staff there. Now, according to White's Directory in 1850, Reverend Parker was responsible for rebuilding and subsequently enlarging this building, Luffingcott Rectory. He died in the early 1880s. He was still a bachelor, and his body was buried outside the east window of the church. And according to the Reverend Norman McGee, who was writing about this case in 1959, Parker said that he had a wish to be buried outside of the church for this reason. He is said to have been very happy at Luffingcott, said McGee, and the saying goes that he was wont to express a wish that no successor should ever dispossess him of what he had come to regard as his own. So, of course, Reverend Parker is followed by other vicars, one of whom is the Reverend Thomas Ward Brown, and it was he who was frightened from this rectory a few years later. Reverend Brown was described as a fairly stout man with a small pointed beard. He was known for wearing that broad-brimmed hat, which is traditional for priests at the time. He had a notable way of walking with his head down. That was because he was partly paralysed. He wasn't especially wealthy. He had no staff. Like Frank Parker, he lived on his own. One day, thought to be around the year 1901, Reverend Brown is sitting down to his evening meal in the rectory on his own as usual and reading a book while he ate. On glancing up from the book, he saw what he said was the ghost of Reverend Parker standing before him. Now, if the story is to be believed, as it was related in the 1950s, Reverend Brown was so terrified by this that he upped and left the rectory immediately, fleeing to the nearby village of Clawton, where he'd previously held the position of curate, and seeking sanctuary from the farmer with whom he had lived when he was there. He was never to return to Luffingcott Rectory again, and he wouldn't allow any of his possessions to be retrieved. Even his half-finished meal stayed sat on the table. For 2 more years, Reverend Brown continues in the position of rector at Luffingcott, but he stayed living in Clawton. Now, some sources say that he was taken to the church each Sunday by his landlord on a pony and trap, but most of them note that he walked the 4.5-mile round trip in his cassock. If that was the case, then that would have been quite a feat for somebody who was partly paralysed. He'd deliver the service, then he'd sit in the church porch and eat his lunch, then he'd do the evening service and return home. His possessions, it said, stayed in the rectory until some of the less upstanding members of the community decided that if the Reverend didn't want them, they might as well make sure they didn't go to waste, so they were gradually removed from the property. Now, Luffingcott naturally developed a reputation for this haunting, and people began to break windows to gain entry into the empty property and stay the night there. So the building fell into a poor state of repair, and finally it was burned down. Whether that was deliberate or accidental is something to which we will never really find an answer. There are certainly many mysteries in the story. The third chapter of the book also looks at ghosts in some other versions as well, particularly looking at folk ghosts or legendary examples of ghost stories. Now, when we look at stories of ghosts in folklore, we need to do so from the perspective that there are two main types. That's alleged sightings of ghosts that you might make now when you leave the building, and folk ghosts. So the former can be investigated because there'll be dates, there'll be third-party involvement. They will have happened in the relatively recent past. They're more the realm of the paranormal investigator. They will become of interest to people like me, folklorists, later if the story sticks around. Folk ghosts are more legendary in nature. They often have impossible aspects to the story which aren't found in simpler haunting stories. They might also haunt many different locations at the same time, like celebrity ghosts like Anne Boleyn, who's everywhere. There's another important question which we ought to ask at this point, of course, and that is, what is a ghost? More specifically, in terms of folklore, what is a ghost? Well, the answer isn't as obvious and easy as it might appear. The apparition of a previously living being would be the response a lot of people give, but it's not quite that straightforward. The makeup of the symbol to which we might give the name ghost is a bit more fluid than that. That's because the way that we understand symbols in the first place might change depending on where we are or, historically, when we are. In folklore, ghosts often appear as a replacement from some other story or motif that came before them. In medieval English texts, there are lots of examples of people being afraid of revenants, that is, creatures who rise up from the grave at night and wander around liberally spreading death wherever they go. Later, these undead creatures gradually get replaced by ghosts as the source of the fear. We see a similar process with the antiquated scapegoat of the fairy, which Elizabeth is talking about next, being replaced by more modern and sleek aliens with reference to abduction stories. Those fairies would often have been the explanation for a particular event in a location that we now term as haunted instead. So reports of hauntings that have some basis in truth go back a long way in the historical record. One of the earliest is recorded by Pliny the Younger with regards to a house in Athens in the 1st century AD. It's distinct from the usual stories in classical Greek literature, which have much more mythological roots to them. Now, Pliny wrote, "In the dead of night a noise was frequently heard resembling the clashing of iron, which if you listened carefully sounded like the rattling of chains. The noise would seem to be a distance away, but it would start coming closer and closer and closer. Immediately after this, a spectre would appear in the form of an old man, emaciated and squalid, with bristling hair and a long beard, and rattling the chains on his hands and feet as he moved." Now, this haunting became such a problem for the people living in the house that it became impossible to find anybody else to take the house on. However, after a while, the philosopher Anthrodorus appears, finds the house for sale at a very low price. He's not fussed about stories of hauntings, so he buys it. He doesn't believe in the ghost. Until one night, he hears the chains and the spirit appears, and the ghost beckons Athenodorus to follow, so he does. Goes out into the courtyard, and the ghost disappears. He's a clever man, is Athenodorus, so he realizes that there's a spot here which needs digging. So the next day, he digs in that spot, finds the skeleton of a man in chains, obviously very old because of the corrosion on it, arranges a proper burial, and the ghost is never seen again. Now, of course, this is quite a common story in terms of folklore, and it shows how very old accounts can raise a number of difficulties. Original sightings can be recorded as true at the time, but centuries later the boundaries become indistinct, and what begin as eyewitness accounts take on different aspects of folk ghosts. Now, there are lots of different types of these. The book covers phantom coaches and penitential spirits, but one aspect which comes up in many cases is that of ritual or repetition in the way that they repeatedly play out. Repetition is a large part of the ritualistic behaviour in any culture, and that can be from small gestures like handshakes right through to big things like annual celebrations. Ritual in this sense applies more to the fact that ghosts are calendrical, and they appear on the same date each year and perform the same function. Now, none of us expect to see a folk ghost. After all, if a phantom coach really did appear at 2 a.m. every Friday night down the road, we'd have proven the existence of ghosts long ago, and people like Deborah there would be out of a job as a skeptic. We aren't really trying to prove that a folk ghost exists. Proving the existence of things isn't the role of the folklorist. There isn't much in the makeup of these types of ghost stories to say that they actually represent real hauntings. What they show, by virtue of the fact that they continue to come up in local history books and travel guides and stately home leaflets and the National Trust website and so on, is the strength of storytelling and its power of embedding tales in our social history and culture. Now, another of the darker sides of storytelling, and one which extends firmly into the modern digital realm of folklore, is that of urban legends. So the chapter on this subject, Tracy starts by telling a story which she first heard when she was 10 years old. You might know this story too. It concerns a girl and her boyfriend whose car breaks down at night on a deserted road. The boyfriend goes for help and the girl stays in the car. Time passes. The boyfriend hasn't returned. The girl begins to get nervous. The branch of a tree is tapping on the roof of the car, breaking the silence which would otherwise pervade. The night wears on, still the boyfriend doesn't return. Then suddenly the car is surrounded by police officers. She's told to get out and walk to the police officers and not to look back. So she gets out and begins walking, and of course, silly girl turns around and looks back. On the top of the car, she sees a man with an axe. The boyfriend's head is on the end of the axe, and the killer is tapping the roof of the car with it. A typical example of an urban legend. That one's called the murdered boyfriend. Now, that's the European version of that story. Urban legends often take on regional variations. In the American version, the boyfriend has been strung up by the killer, and the tapping noise is the blood dripping on the roof of the car. Another legend with regional variations is the one of the family that goes off on a driving holiday, parents and children and the grandmother. While they're on the road, poor old granny dies. And because the kids don't want to share the back of the car with a corpse, the father bundles her up in a blanket and puts her on the roof rack. They drive to the nearest town to seek advice, and while they're gone, the car is stolen. The family never recover any of the belongings, including Granny. Urban legend expert Jan Harold Brunvand says in the American version, the family are towing a boat, and Grandma gets put in the boat instead, and the boat is stolen. Now, the story certainly exhibits the irreverence with which many urban legends are laced. I was asked a while ago by a journalist to talk about a similar one. This one, Dead Dog in a Suitcase. You can find the article on vice.com if you want to read it. Essentially, a girl is dog-sitting for her boss or some variation. There's a golden retriever or an Alsatian, which is particularly elderly. It dies while the girl is looking after it, so she phones the boss up. He tells her to take it to be cremated, so she puts it in a wheeled suitcase and takes it across town. On the tube or on the subway, depending on where it's set, a man gives her help to lift the suitcase up the stairs. "My God, this suitcase is heavy," says the man. "What are you doing?" "Oh, I'm just moving house," says the girl innocently. So he hits her and steals the suitcase and ends up with dead dog. That story has been reported a number of times as factual, most recently on quite a large true crime podcast. Also in the Metro in the 1990s. Also in the New York Post in 1987. Brunvand thinks it probably comes from 1986 when he heard it twice, but it could be older than that. They're often much older than you think. The story about the man who picked up a dropped wallet and returned it to its owner, only to be thanked with the information to stay away from that shopping centre on Halloween because there's going to be a terrorist attack, was also told after a car bomb in Australia, with the wallet being returned to an unnamed Muslim girl. And back in 1917, the exact same story was told, with the owner of the wallet being a German and the terrorist attack being a bombing raid. Another good one is the 1980s panic about baby alligators being taken home as pets and subsequently being flushed down the toilet. You all know this one. That story was foreshadowed in London in 1859 by the story of the sewer pigs of Hampstead. This was a monstrous porcine family which had taken up residence in the London sewers after the sow became trapped and gave birth to a litter of piglets. The piglets lived off the rubbish in the waste in the sewers, and they bred to make more piglets, and so on. The story featured in the Daily Telegraph, and everybody in London lived in fear of the pigs breaking out and rampaging through the city. Now, obviously, pigs could not live in this way in the sewers. The fear connected with this urban legend is more about disease, and in particular the fear of typhoid and cholera. The summer of the previous year had been particularly hot. There'd been an outbreak of both. There are other common aspects of an urban legend, of course. Usually something is too good to be true. Some form of karma is doled out on somebody, like the person who's rude to somebody on a train and then finds themselves sitting in front of them in a job interview later on in the day. Some urban legends spread more easily, and those are the ones that warn against something. In terms of social media especially, people think they're doing a good thing by sending on a message with a warning, because somebody else might be saved from something, so they just send it on without thinking about it, or fact-checking it. There's been a number of recent examples of that. That's probably one of the most well-known ones. The 2018 Momo Challenge originated online as a series of challenges to be completed, a bit like the Blue Whale Challenge, which was linked with teenage suicide cults in Russia and elsewhere. In the original form of the Momo Challenge, threats would be made by the character of Momo if the victim refused any of the challenges. Now, the character as seen in this slide wasn't part of the original version of the Momo Challenge at all. The first version died away a few months after it had started. But it came back with a vengeance in 2019, with reports of clips featuring Momo, as pictured here, being inserted into children's videos like Peppa Pig on YouTube. The image also began to circulate widely on social media. It was said that the image on the right there was Momo, just in case you're confused as to which is Momo and which is Peppa Pig, and that was the source of threatening messages which would be sent via WhatsApp and so on. Now, schools across the country rapidly picked up on this story and they sent letters home. In fact, we received one from our daughter's school about it. At the time, Snopes and other fact-checking websites still had the Momo Challenge down as unproven. Now, we asked our daughter about this, and she didn't particularly remember anything at all being discussed amongst children at school. All she really remembers is what she refers to as the creepy chicken woman thing. Now, the panic over Momo was widespread, and it cropped up in many other countries like Argentina and Canada and Pakistan. Despite such a widespread phenomenon, there seems to be a surprising lack of real evidence to back it up, especially when you consider that photographic evidence of completion of the tasks was supposed to be part of the challenge. In the UK, a concerned mother appeared in the news in February of 2019 talking about it. That seems to be what caused the resurgence here, but the origin of the earlier version is unknown. Some believe it began via WhatsApp in Mexico. We do know the image turned out to be a sculpture created in 2016 by a Japanese special effects company, Link Factory. Subsequently, it was destroyed because it had started to decompose. Now, Mexico also comes up in the last subject which we are examining here, and that is the subject of dark tourism and legend tripping. Now, dark tourism refers to those people who like to take holidays which engage with sites of death or trauma or tragedy. It doesn't sound like something which most of us would consider doing for fun, but in fact there is much to this practice which links us both to our past and to our emotional and social connections. It engages with both cultural heritage and folklore on lots of different levels. Before I go into this last section of the talk, I do want to give a content warning so that you can consider that this last section does deal with themes of death and suicide. It also includes pictures of dead bodies, but not in a morbid way. If any of those sorts of things will trouble you for the next 10 minutes, do leave the room. I will not be offended. Much like some of the other stories which we've heard today, the concept of dark tourism is older than you would think, although it's only since the 1990s that it's become particularly popular. In 1815, members of the European nobility and aristocracy paid very good prices for seats from where they could relax and observe the Battle of Waterloo unfolding. The same thing happened in the 1860s. Picnics were organised in Virginia so that groups could sit and snack while they watched the first large battle of the American Civil War. 2 days later, a couple of enterprising people from the audience bought the battlefield and marketed it as a tourist attraction. The term dark tourism as we know it now comes from 1986 in a Heritage Studies Journal paper which talks about the Kennedy assassination. It defines it as the presentation and consumption by visitors of real and commodified death and disaster sites. A later term narrowed that down specifically to activities which engaged with the concept of death specifically. That is thanatourism, from the Greek thanatos, for death. Death, in fact, has been a part of the tourist industry far longer than any other element. Think about the Colosseum in Rome, for example. Thanatourists make a connection between people themselves and the deceased. A good example is the escalation from people visiting the site of Princess Diana's car crash and the railings of Kensington Palace becoming one of the world's largest contemporary assemblages, when what was effectively an escalation of mass hysteria turned it into a shrine. Similar things have happened, albeit on a smaller scale, when the characters are purely fictional. Here's Yanto's shrine for those that watched Torchwood in Cardiff Bay. Still looks like that to this day. Dark tourism might deal with aspects of death in many forms. Some of these are celebratory, and there's a lot of discussion in the book about the cult of Santa Muerta, for example, in Mexico City, and the Day of the Dead. Another ceremonial celebration of death, which is, or at least was, very personal, but has since become a tourist destination as well, is that of the Menen Funeral rite, which takes place in Indonesia. Some of you may know this. It was largely unknown in Western culture for many years, before being highlighted through some articles in the tabloid press and featuring in the 2018 Netflix series Dark Tourist. It's the funerary celebration of the Torajan people. The Torajans live in the South Sulawesi part of Indonesia, and the funerary customs are the most important part of their life, but they are also the most expensive. Fundraising and arranging a funeral can take many months, during which time the body of the deceased is kept at home. Because until they are interred, family members do not see them as dead in this culture. They are rather tumakula, which means sick. The soul remains in the house during this period. Whilst they are caring for the sick person, the family will still bring them meals. They'll still accept guests into the house, and that includes tourists. And those people would be expected to give offerings of money or food or cigarettes to the sick person via the living relatives. Now, the Torajan don't see death as a full stop. Rather, it's a transition through the veil to the next stage of their journey. Now, this doesn't mean that there isn't grief shown. There is. It can periodically happen long after burial, in fact. And especially, that is because this outlook means that the dead are cared for long after burial, because their bodies are exhumed and reclothed and checked and spoken to. And that is the Menen itself, the second funeral. Bodies are dug up, they're laid out for fresh air and sunshine, they're given snacks or other goods. Family members will pose for photographs with their deceased relatives, because after all, the pervasive smartphone has made it as far as the South Sulawesi. Tourists also have the chance to do the same thing. Rather than being sad affairs, people who visit say the whole experience is actually very comforting. To us here in the West, death is very much a final step and something to be feared by many. The Menen goes back to a time in our own past when our ancestors believed more in the celebratory aspect of the journey. Now, dark or thanatourism can also be linked to the tragedy of death as well as the celebration of it, of course, and that's certainly true in the case of the Aokigahara forest in Japan, known colloquially as the suicide forest. The forest sits on a bed of lava from eruptions of Mount Fuji, and it covers a massive area, 30 to 35 square kilometres. Locals here say there are three types of people who visit this forest. Those who explore the trails, the dark tourists who come to experience the atmosphere, and the people who do not intend to come back. The forest has been a hotspot for suicides since the 1950s. Figures used to show an average increase of between 10 and 30% a year of cases until figures stopped being published in an effort to deter people from using it for that purpose. Now, many sources will tell you that the popularity of this location for suicide is down to a book called Tower of Waves, published in 1960, a fiction title which ends its story with a joint suicide in the Aokigahara forest. But that is actually one of the myths about this area. Spikes in the number of suicides are more likely to be linked to poor economic conditions in Japan, and they peak in March, which is the end of the Japanese financial year. Being popular for suicides doesn't by default make a location naturally creepy. Number one spot in the world for suicides is the Golden Gate Bridge. That's not remotely creepy at all. To have a feeling of spookiness, there need to be other factors at work, and that is the case in the Aokigahara forest. For example, the ground is a hardened lava base. That means it's very porous, and that means that sound is naturally deadened. It's also full of magnetic iron from the eruptions, and that means if you're carrying a compass, it will work fine, but if you put it on the ground, it will behave very erratically. That has led to stories of people being lured from the path by unseen forces. Now, the spiritual beliefs of the Japanese mean that they see the lands around the forest being haunted by the souls of those who died there in the form of yurei, Japanese ghosts. They're often associated with traumatic death. It's these ghosts which are said to be responsible for luring travellers from the paths in the manner of being pixie-led here, for example, and also for affecting compasses in the area. Corpses of suicide victims transformed into yurei are said to scream at night and to move around if left unattended. Both the police and the forest guards have special rooms which they use for the corpses that are retrieved from the forest. It's said that the guards play rock, paper, scissors to determine who will keep watch over the body overnight. One final element of dark tourism, which I want to briefly touch on, is legend tripping. Now, that's where the people attach the legend itself to a tourist experience because they want to try and be a part of it or experience something that goes on there. This is the Black Angel Museum, a monument in Oakland Cemetery in Iowa, and this is a particular aspect of legend tripping. So there are lots of stories about this monument. It was originally bronze. It turned black after exposure to the air. It's the monument of the Feldevert family. It's inscribed with only the birth date and not the death date of the lady who commissioned it. Much of the inscription is also in a foreign language because she travelled to Iowa from Czechoslovakia. This has led to legend texts about this. Stories vary depending on the people interacting with it, their age or their cultural background. So older people will see this as being a very sympathetic story, some form of sorrow being shown by the angel for the child that is buried there. Stories from younger tourists say that the events happened because of retribution for the sins of the woman when she was alive. She might have been a witch. There are dares associated with this monument. Some form of retribution is said to take place depending on what you do here. So if you touch the angel, or you kiss, or have sex in front of it, or something like that, these can all lead to bad luck. Another story says that if you look into the eyes of the angel, it will curse you, for example. So, dark tourism and legend tripping are both about not what participants understand a legend to be, but what they do with the narrative of a legend and how they interact with the location. It's easy for that to be misinterpreted because of the dark nature of the subject matter involved. It's the reason that cemeteries or abandoned churches with legends attached to them often end up with stories of cult activity or some kind of satanic panic being connected with them. I want to close with this thought. At the end of the day, legend tripping is usually undertaken for entertainment and for fun. Dark tourism, for education, yes, but also for interest and entertainment. Many people see the idea of dark tourism as unappealing. This is increasingly the case in our somewhat worrying cancel culture, which is leading to the removal of reminders of our cultural history. Rather than acknowledgement and interpretation that, yes, these things were wrong and that they are not part of our modern societal norms, but they happened and they should be explained and remembered. To remove them completely is to deny a narrative to the victims. There are enough voiceless victims in our pasts already. The power of legends is that they can make and transform locations through the way that people interact with them. Many people harness the perceived negative potential of ostension in a folk narrative and turn it into a personal or a cultural positive. There will always be dark themes in our folklore, so let's just treat them in that positive way. Thank you.